Dean Tipton heard his 6-year-old son screaming from upstairs. He ran to check him. What he found was a stranger stabbing Logan to death with a kitchen knife. Dean tried to stop him, and was thrown across the room, stabbed, and had his head stomped while his son bled out feet away. That was December 2015. In October 2025, the man who murdered his child walked out of prison after just 7 years. How does someone brutally murder a 6-year-old, nearly kill his father, and walk free before most criminals finish their sentences? In October 2025, Ronald Exantus walked out of a Kentucky prison into freedom. No dramatic escape, no complicated legal tricks, no overturned conviction. Just a quiet release after serving less than 7 years of a 20-year sentence for one of the most brutal crimes in Woodford County history. The release came with good behavior credits, a standard prison practice that rewards inmates for following rules and joining programs. In Exantus's case, these credits cut his 20-year sentence by more than half, letting him walk free after serving barely a third of his punishment. Dean Tipton learned about the release the way no parent should ever find out their child's killer is free, from the news. No official call, no victim services warning, no heads up that the man who destroyed his family was about to walk back into society. Just a news report that broke apart whatever fragile peace Dean had managed to build in the years since that December night. The lack of warning wasn't a mistake, it's how the system works. Parole releases don't require victim notification in many states, meaning families can be blindsided by the sudden freedom of the people who destroyed their lives. Dean had been living with the belief that he had years before facing this moment, years to prepare mentally for the day when Exantus might walk free. Instead, he got a news alert. Dean Tipton's life can be divided into 2 parts, before December 7, 2015, and after. The man who existed before that night, a father of 3, a provider, someone with hopes and plans and a future, died alongside his 6-year-old son. What remained was someone trying to remember why living mattered.
I laid in bed. I gave up on life.
Dean's words capture the destruction that goes far beyond the night of the murder. This isn't about grief that fades with time or trauma that therapy can heal. This is about a basic break in someone's will to exist, caused by watching their child die while being unable to stop it. The physical injuries Dean got that night, the stab wounds, the impact from being thrown 10 feet, the trauma from having his head stomped, those healed eventually. But the mental wounds, the memory of Logan's screams, the image of a stranger killing his son while he lay helpless nearby, the knowledge that he tried to save his child and failed, those wounds never close. Learning that Exantus was free reopened everything. Not just the memories of that night, but the basic question that haunts every parent in Dean's position: what was it all for? The testimony in court, reliving the horror for the jury, the years of trying to piece together some kind of life afterward, all of it made meaningless by a system that decided 7 years was enough payment for murdering a child. The Ronald Exantus release didn't stay a local Kentucky story for long. Social media exploded with anger as details spread about the brutal murder of a 6-year-old and the killer's early release after less than a third of his sentence. The White House put out a statement saying they were looking into the case, political speak that recognized public anger while making no real promises. The attention was unusual for a state-level criminal case, but the mix of factors made it impossible to ignore: the victim's age, the brutality of the crime, the insanity defense, and the shocking shortness of actual time served. Questions flooded social media and news coverage. How does the insanity defense work? Why was Exantus in regular prison instead of a mental health facility if he was legally insane? How do good behavior credits apply to someone found not guilty by reason of insanity? And most basically, how is 7 years justice for murdering a child? But behind these questions was a deeper concern that hits home with every parent in America: if someone can do what Exantus did and walk free in 7 years, how safe are our children? The insanity defense is supposed to protect society from dangerous mentally ill people while making sure they get treatment. Exantus's release suggested the system was doing neither. The anger wasn't just about Ronald Exantus. It was about a justice system that seemed to value the rights and recovery of convicted killers more than the safety of innocent children and the peace of broken families. Versailles, Kentucky is the kind of small town where people know their neighbors, where children play outside without constant watching, where locked doors are more habit than necessity. With barely 10,000 people, it's a place where violent crime feels like something that happens somewhere else, to other people, in different kinds of communities. The Tipton family lived small-town American life. Dean worked hard to provide for his wife and 3 children, building the kind of stable, ordinary life that doesn't make news because it's so wonderfully normal. Logan, at 6 years old, was in that magical phase of childhood where every day brings new discoveries, where the world still feels safe and full of possibilities. The 2 sisters, whose ages have been kept private to protect them, were living their own childhoods in a home that felt secure and loving. This wasn't a family dealing with obvious threats or living in fear, they were simply living, trusting that their locked doors and alarm systems and the general safety of their community would protect them. December 7th started as an ordinary day. School, work, dinner, evening routines. The kind of day that families across America experience millions of times without problems. Children finished homework, parents handled end-of-day tasks, everyone got ready for bed expecting to wake up the next morning and do it all again. By the time the family went to sleep that night, they had no idea that a stranger had traveled from Indianapolis specifically to destroy them. They had no warning that their locked doors wouldn't keep out the violence that was coming. They simply went to bed, trusting in the safety that their community and their home had always provided. That trust would cost Logan his life and destroy his family forever. Ronald Exantus wasn't a random drifter or a local criminal with a history of violence in Versailles. He was a dialysis nurse from Indianapolis, someone with medical training, someone trusted to care for weak patients, someone who looked like a professional working member of society. The drive from Indianapolis to Versailles is roughly 2 hours, depending on traffic and route. Exantus made this journey with a specific purpose that police would later try to understand. This wasn't a random crime that just happened, it was a planned trip across state lines to commit violence against a family. What connected Exantus to the Tipton family remains one of the most disturbing parts of the case. There's no sign of prior relationship, no evidence of personal fight or conflict, no clear motive that makes sense to normal minds. A stranger traveling 2 hours to break into a home and murder a child goes against the usual stories we use to make sense of violence. This randomness, the lack of connection, the absence of understandable motive, makes the crime even more terrifying for families like the Tiptons. They couldn't have prevented this through better locks or alarm systems or being more aware of threats. They couldn't have avoided Exantus because they didn't know he existed until the moment he appeared in their home with a knife. The fact that Exantus was a healthcare professional adds another layer of horror. This wasn't someone that society had already identified as dangerous, someone with a criminal record or obvious warning signs. This was someone who held a responsible job caring for weak patients, someone who had passed background checks and professional licensing tests. How does someone with the training and supposed compassion of a nurse become capable of entering a home and stabbing a sleeping 6-year-old to death? That question would become central to the insanity defense that would later decide Exantus's fate. Exantus didn't stay on the main floor or try to steal valuables like a typical burglar. He went upstairs, where the children slept, heading directly to where the most vulnerable members of the household were at their most defenseless. This wasn't random violence or crime that just happened, it was targeted movement toward the children. 6-year-old Logan was asleep in his bed when Exantus entered his room. What should have been the safest place in Logan's world, his own bedroom, in his own home, with his family nearby, became the site of unimaginable horror. The attack wasn't quick or merciful. According to court records, Exantus stabbed and slashed Logan repeatedly in the head with a kitchen knife. The brutality of the attack, the repeated strikes against a small child who posed no threat, reveals the complete absence of mercy or control that defined this crime. Logan's screams pierced the night, alerting his family that something was horrifyingly wrong. In those moments between hearing his son's cries and reaching Logan's room, Dean Tipton was probably experiencing the worst fear any parent can imagine, knowing your child is in danger but not yet understanding how bad the threat is or whether you can stop it. What Dean found when he reached Logan's room would haunt him forever. His small son, brutally wounded, with a stranger continuing the attack. In that moment, Dean had to make an impossible choice that every parent prays they'll never face: try to fight off the attacker, or try to save the child who was already badly wounded. Every parent's nightmare is hearing their child scream and not being able to stop what's happening. Dean Tipton lived that nightmare and discovered something even worse, that trying to save his son would cost him the ability to help. Dean Tipton didn't hesitate. When he saw Exantus attacking Logan, he did what any father would do: he tried to stop it. He tried to physically step in, to pull Exantus away from his son, to end the violence that was killing Logan. Exantus turned on Dean with the same brutal violence he'd shown Logan. According to court testimony, Exantus stabbed Dean, then showed strength that seemed almost superhuman, throwing Dean 10 or more feet across the room. This wasn't just pushing someone away, it was the kind of force that suggests either extraordinary strength or complete disconnect from normal human limits. But Exantus wasn't finished with Dean. As Dean lay wounded and stunned from the impact, Exantus stomped on his head, an action that speaks to rage and intent to kill. This wasn't defensive violence from someone trying to escape. This was an attempt to kill the person trying to stop the attack on Logan. Dean was left unable to move, wounded and injured, while his son continued to die nearby. The helplessness of that moment, being awake, knowing Logan needed help, but being unable to provide it, represents a mental torture that goes far beyond the physical injuries. By the time emergency responders arrived, Logan Tipton was beyond saving. The small boy who had gone to bed safely hours earlier was dead, killed by a stranger in his own bedroom despite his father's desperate attempt to save him. Dean survived his injuries, but as he would later testify, he lost his will to live that night. The physical wounds would heal eventually, but the mental damage, watching your child die, failing to stop it despite trying, surviving when your child didn't, that kind of trauma doesn't heal with time. Police arriving at the Tipton home found a scene of brutal violence that shocked even experienced officers. A small child dead, a father badly wounded, 2 daughters injured, and a suspect who had made no attempt to run despite having time to escape. Ronald Exantus was arrested at the scene without major resistance. Unlike many violent criminals who try to avoid capture or claim innocence, Exantus's behavior suggested someone disconnected from the reality of what he'd done. This disconnect would become crucial to the defense strategy that would later shape his trial. Emergency responders rushed Dean and the 2 sisters to the hospital while police began processing what would become a straightforward case in terms of identifying who did it, but a complicated one in terms of understanding motive and mental state. Versailles' small-town nature meant this crime took over local talk immediately. A child murdered in his bed, a family destroyed by random violence, a stranger from out of state who seemingly had no connection to the victims. Every element of the case went against the community's sense of safety and predictability. The investigation quickly established basic facts. Exantus had traveled from Indianapolis, had no clear prior relationship with the Tiptons, had used a kitchen knife in the attack, and had remained at the scene. Physical evidence was overwhelming, witnesses were clear, and Exantus wasn't denying his actions. But understanding why, understanding what could motivate a dialysis nurse to drive 2 hours to kill a child he'd never met, that remained hard to figure out. Prosecutors faced an unusual situation. They had a clear killer, overwhelming evidence, and a crime so brutal that conviction seemed certain. But as they dug into Exantus's background, mental health history, and behavior, they began to see the defense strategy that would ultimately shape the trial. Exantus's background as a healthcare professional initially seemed inconsistent with such brutal violence. How does someone trusted to care for weak patients become capable of murdering a child? The disconnect suggested either a complete break from reality or a capacity for violence that had somehow remained hidden during his professional career. Mental health experts began evaluating Exantus, looking for explanations for behavior that seemed impossible to understand for normal minds. The randomness of picking the victims, the brutality of the attack, the lack of logical motive, all suggested possible mental health issues that would become central to legal proceedings. Prosecutors knew they were facing a possible insanity defense and began preparing for the complex task of arguing that even if Exantus was mentally ill, he should still be held fully responsible for his actions. The difference between mentally ill and legally insane would become crucial. If cases where the system fails victims, or barely gets it right, frustrate you as much as they frustrate us, subscribe. We cover the crime stories that show how justice actually works in America, not how it should work. Meanwhile, the Tipton family was trying to survive their own nightmare. Logan was dead. Dean was physically recovering but mentally destroyed. The family had to prepare for a trial that would force them to relive the worst night of their lives while watching the man who destroyed them try to avoid full responsibility. When Ronald Exantus finally stood trial in 2018, nearly 3 years after Logan's murder, the courtroom became a battleground not just over guilt, that was never really in question, but over the nature of responsibility and what justice looks like when mental illness meets horrific violence. Dean Tipton took the stand and testified about the night his son died. Having to describe hearing Logan's screams, finding Exantus attacking his child, trying to stop it and being violently beaten down, lying wounded while his son died nearby, every word was torture for a father still trying to understand how to keep living after such loss. The prosecution showed medical evidence about Logan's injuries, the repeated stab and slash wounds to his head, the brutality of an attack on a small child who posed no threat. They showed evidence of Dean's injuries, the violence done to the two sisters, the calculated nature of Exantus traveling from Indianapolis and going directly to where the children slept. The sisters testified about their injuries and the trauma of that night, adding to the weight of evidence about a sustained, brutal attack on an entire family. The prosecution's case was overwhelming in terms of establishing what Exantus had done. But the defense wasn't disputing the facts of the attack. They were arguing something more complex, that Ronald Exantus, at the time of these acts, was legally insane and therefore couldn't be held fully responsible for his actions in the same way a normal person would be. The insanity defense is one of the most misunderstood parts of criminal law. Popular culture suggests it's an easy escape that guilty people use to avoid consequences, but the reality is far more complex and the defense succeeds far less often than most people believe. The defense brought expert witnesses who testified about Exantus's mental state, arguing that his actions that night were the product of a mental break or severe mental illness that stopped him from understanding what he was doing or why it was wrong. They pointed to the randomness of the crime, the lack of logical motive, the extreme brutality as evidence of someone not in control of their mind. The prosecution fought back with their own experts arguing that even if Exantus was mentally ill, he showed enough planning and normal behavior, traveling to Versailles, entering the home, going directly to where children slept, to suggest he understood what he was doing. The jury faced an impossible task, weighing complex mental health testimony, evaluating whether someone who committed such a brutal act could be legally insane, and deciding what justice looks like when mental illness and violence cross paths. After hearing weeks of testimony about violence, trauma, and mental illness, the jury returned a verdict that satisfied no one and confused many. Ronald Exantus was found not guilty by reason of insanity for the murder of Logan Tipton. On its face, this verdict sounds like Exantus got away with murder. But the jury didn't stop there. They also found him guilty but mentally ill on the assault charges against Dean and the two sisters. This split verdict revealed the jury's struggle to balance the brutality of the crime with the evidence of mental illness. The "not guilty by reason of insanity" verdict for Logan's murder theoretically meant Exantus should have been sent to a secure mental health facility forever, getting treatment until psychiatrists decided he was no longer a danger to society. This commitment can last far longer than a prison sentence because it's not about punishment but about public safety and treatment. But the "guilty but mentally ill" verdicts on the assault charges created a different outcome. Judge's sentence, 20 years in prison, 10 years for each second-degree assault conviction running at the same time, plus 1 year for fourth-degree assault. This meant Exantus would serve time in regular prison, not a mental health facility. Dean Tipton sat in that courtroom and heard that the man who murdered his son was not guilty of that murder. Legally, technically, Exantus wasn't a murderer in the eyes of the law, he was someone who had committed violence while legally insane. But he was still going to prison for 20 years for the assaults. The community struggled to understand how the same person could be legally insane for killing a child but guilty for attacking that child's father and sisters during the same attack. The split verdict highlighted the complexities and sometimes contradictions of trying to apply legal standards to situations involving severe mental illness and extreme violence. 20 years felt too short for the murder of a child and the destruction of a family, but it was better than the fear that Exantus might be released from a mental facility after a few years of treatment. The Tipton family left the courthouse with the small comfort of knowing Exantus would be locked up for 2 decades. Except that's not what happened. The American criminal justice system is built on multiple overlapping rules that affect how long convicted people actually serve. Parole eligibility, good behavior credits, time served waiting for trial, sentence reductions for joining programs, all of these can dramatically reduce actual time locked up compared to the sentence announced in court. In Exantus's case, his 20-year sentence came with parole eligibility after just 4 years, meaning by December 2019, he could technically be released if a parole board decided he was fixed and no longer a danger to society. This shocked the Tipton family, who had understood 20 years to mean 2 decades of certainty that Exantus was confined. But even before parole eligibility kicked in, good behavior credits were piling up. Federal and state prison systems reward inmates for following rules, joining programs, avoiding trouble. These credits can reduce sentences by big percentages, theoretically encouraging improvement and cooperation. The problem is that good behavior in prison doesn't necessarily show whether someone is safe to release back into society. An inmate can follow prison rules perfectly while still being a danger to the public. The skills required to avoid trouble in a controlled prison setting don't translate to being a non-violent member of free society. Exantus piled up enough credits and satisfied enough requirements that by October 2025, less than 7 years after his 2018 sentencing, he was released. The 20-year sentence that was supposed to keep him locked up until 2038 ended in 2025. Dean Tipton, who thought he had another 13 years before having to face his son's killer walking free, was blindsided. Every time a verdict like this passes quietly, another family gets blindsided. Don't let this be one of those times. Subscribe now, because silence only protects the broken system that freed him. And tell me in the comments, what kind of system frees a child killer, and calls it law? A child is brutally murdered. The killer is found not guilty by reason of insanity for the murder but still gets 20 years for the assaults. 7 years later, he walks free. At what point does the insanity defense become a get-out-of-jail card instead of a pathway to treatment? The ongoing failure the Tipton family's nightmare didn't end with Exantus's release. In many ways, it just started a new chapter. The man who killed Logan is now free to live his life, to walk streets, to potentially have opportunities that Logan will never experience because his life ended at age 6. Dean Tipton is still trying to find a reason to live. The two sisters have to live knowing that the man who hurt them and killed their brother has served his time and moved on. Their trauma doesn't end just because Exantus's sentence did. They still carry the memories of that night, the fear, the loss of their brother, the knowledge that violence can invade even the safest spaces. The White House statement about looking into the case likely won't result in any changes to Exantus's status. His release was legal, following established procedures for sentence reduction and parole eligibility. The system worked exactly as designed. It's the design itself that created this outcome. Ronald Exantus is free. Logan Tipton is dead. The two sisters are traumatized. And America is left asking questions that have no satisfying answers. How long is long enough for someone who murdered a child to be locked up? What does recovery even mean for someone found legally insane at the time of their crime? The insanity defense exists because we've decided as a society that punishing someone who literally couldn't understand their actions is unjust. But when that principle results in child killers serving 7 years while families suffer forever, something feels deeply broken. Exantus walks free while Dean Tipton remains trapped by trauma, by loss, by memories of his son's screams and his own helplessness. Logan would be 15 years old now if he'd been allowed to live. He'd be in high school, discovering who he was becoming, making plans for his future. Instead, he's frozen at age 6, remembered for how he died rather than how he would have lived, and somewhere in America, Ronald Exantus is free to live the life he took from a 6-year-old boy. The Tipton family's fight for justice didn't end with Exantus's prison sentence, and it didn't end with his release. If you want to follow what happens next in cases like this, the ongoing battles, the attempts at reform, the families who refuse to let society forget, subscribe. Because some stories don't end just because the system says they're over. Thank you for watching.